1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 1 through 5. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. This is the first half of the text that we'll preach through on Sunday. We'll go all the way to verse 12 for that. But we're going to dive into this, and what we'll see through this is the difference between tongues and prophecy. And what we'll see as we go through the differences between these is that they have different purposes, different effects on the body, and therefore one becomes more important than the other. And so here we go. It begins with this command: follow the way of love, and the second command that goes with it: eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. So we have commands 1 and 2. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. The way of love comes from chapter 13, where actually in chapter 12 at the end, Paul said, let me show you a still more excellent way. And then in chapter 13, Paul showed what that way was, which was the way of love. And so he says, as he comes into chapter 14, follow the way of love and, I should make that blue, and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit. Now that makes total sense. The next line is interesting, especially prophecy. Why does Paul say that? Especially when we remember that at the end of 13, he told us that prophecy would pass away. Prophecy will pass away. So why would he have us pursue prophecy? And so the next sentence begins with for, which provides the reason for this initial command. And if we're going to section this off, it begins with commands, right? For, here we go, anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. So here's our first reason. Number 1, this is going to be confusing. You know what? I'll do it in green. Reason number 1 for why we should pursue prophecy above the other spiritual gifts. 1, for anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. I'm going to highlight references to speaking in tongues in red. When someone speaks in a tongue, they are not speaking to people, they are speaking to God. Okay? Which means, well, he'll explain that in a second. But let's just take that as it is for now. Speak is the normal word for speak in the Greek. And the word tongue here is the word glossa. The Greeks have kind of 3 different words for languages and speaking. They are glossa, they are dialecto, and they are phonon, right? Glossa is literally tongue. It's where we get our word glossary. Dialecto is more like language, dialect, right? It's where we get our word dialect. And the word phonon is actually technically just sound, but at times it has a alternate meaning for language. And actually, in the other end of this, 11 and 12, you'll see the word languages show up there, and that's the word phonon. But anyways, anyone who speaks in a tongue, glossa, anytime we're looking at the spiritual gift of tongues, you typically see the word glossa. And so if you speak in a tongue, you're not speaking to people, but to God. So we're going to just look, what does that mean, Paul? How am I not speaking to people, but to God? Indeed. So we know he's kind of going to explain, he's going to unpack his statement right here. no one understands them. Oh, okay. Now we know why they're not speaking to people. It's because, bloop, no one understands them. Which means that when someone is speaking in a tongue, they're speaking in a way that is incomprehensible. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. The word utter is very similar to the English word babble. And it's like it could be coherent speech. It could be the sounds that a baby makes, but it's kind of just noisy, maybe intelligible, maybe unintelligible language. So they babble, they utter mysteries by the Spirit. Which is why, again, they're not speaking to people. They're speaking to God, because what they're saying is by the Spirit, and it's a mysterious sound. They don't know what it means, okay? So a lot of times people will say that Acts 2 is the go-to passage on defining tongues. I think it's a really good idea. There's a lot there to be taken. But in Acts 2, they were clearly understanding what was being said. Here in 1 Corinthians 14, no one understands them. So Acts 2 is different. At least the manifestation of the gift of tongues is different here. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But, so contrasting that, the one who prophesies, I'm going to do prophecy in blue. The one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. So it is to God. No one understands them. It's mysteries by the Spirit. We have those three features of this, all right? To God, no one understands them, and mysteries by the Spirit. By the Spirit. Super important that we understand that this mysterious babbling is of the Spirit. But in contrast to that, the one who prophesies speaks to people for strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. So here's our second major reason. The gift of prophecy has different purposes than the gift of tongues. The one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, their encouraging, and comfort. These are very much in line with what we would call preaching today. But I want you to see that they're similar in purpose, and that doesn't mean that the gifts are the same. Because he could say preaching. There's a word for preaching. They're not using the word preaching. They're using the word prophecy. It is a different thing. The prophet receives a word from the Lord through dreams, through visions, or directly from God, and they speak them to the people. And God delivers those messages for strengthening, for encouraging, for comfort, sometimes for rebuke, right? We think of John as he received letters for the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Sometimes it's rebuke, but also those letters strengthened and encouraged and comforted. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves. And this is going to get to what Paul's been talking about for a long time, but we want to love for the purpose of building up the body. So they edify themselves. This would kind of be reason number 3. But in contrast to that, and so, by the way, let me come back to this. They're not speaking to people, but the God no one understands the other mysteries by the Spirit. If you're wondering why would somebody speak in tongues? The answer is it's an edifying practice. It spiritually builds up that individual. And so when we're seeing people speak in tongues, we can't understand them, but they seem to be edified by it. Paul is affirming that reality right here. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves. They're being built up by this. But the one who prophesies edifies the church. So now we have this kind of contrast set up between self-edification and edification of the body. And we already know how Paul feels about edifying yourself versus edifying the body. Paul uses his freedom to love others, not to put himself first. So, of course, that's going to apply here to spiritual gifts as well. He says here in verse 5, I would like every one of you to speak in tongues. He is verifying that tongues are good. Don't take away from this that tongues are somehow bad. They are good, right? I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, in glossa. But, and back to this. Why? Again, because he wants you to be edified. He wants you to experience that. But I would rather have you prophesy. That would be better, right? And so I'm not going to add this as a reasons for why to pursue prophecy. We're not just doing it because of Paul's preference. He's going to unpack his own preference here in the fourth reason. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. I'd rather have you prophesy. Prophesy. And then the one who prophesies is greater. Greater than. I'm going to do that in blue. Is greater than the one who speaks in tongues. Prophecy is greater than the one who speaks in tongues. We have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Why does the gift you practice make you better than somebody else? Let me get rid of that. And I think what's going on here is the way that Jesus would talk about greater and lesser, and I would reference Mark 10 for this. But he says the greatest among you will be servant of all, right? Greatness equals servanthood. And so the idea here is that the one who prophesies is greater because, greater than the one who speaks in tongues, because their gift edifies the body. Their gift makes them a servant of all. And the gift of tongues doesn't do that. It's just for one's self. That's kind of in line with the Corinthians, right? They were always looking out for themselves, always trying to puff themselves up, always trying to look good. And so we kind of see why they liked tongues. And Paul's trying to get them off of themselves and towards the church. So he's like, I would rather have all of you prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless, so there's a caveat to that. Let's not think that the Spirit is assigning gifts without any intention of edifying the body, unless someone interprets. And what this does is it takes that gift of prophecy and it makes it one that doesn't just edify yourself, it makes the whole body be edified, right? So I'm going to go back to this. So that the church may be edified, speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets. Here's this extra piece of information for us, is that that babble, that mystery in the Spirit, someone is gifted to interpret. And when you have someone who can interpret the tongues, now you can use it in a worship setting. Remember that all of these chapters are in reference to the worship setting. It's not about you being in your own room. This is about being with the body at church. We would call church. It's so strange to say it that way. But anyways, in a worship setting, tongues would be inappropriate because it's not about personal edification. It's about the edification of the body. And we could talk a ton about just that. Worship is about the edification of the body. So we don't go to church to make ourselves feel good. We go to church so that the body would be edified. Let that just change your whole perspective on worship. But also it now relates to our gifts. We want to use gifts that the church will be edified by, and therefore speaking in tongues is appropriate only when someone interprets, because now it does the same thing as prophecy, and the whole church can be edified. So going back up to the top, pursue the gift of prophecy. Why? That's the command. And here are his reasons. And there's really 4 reasons. People don't understand when you use tongues. Only God can. 2, prophecy strengthens, encourages, and comforts the body, edifies everyone. 3, edification, tongues only edifies yourself. Prophecy edifies the body. And then 4, the one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues. And then he adds the caveat, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. And so we kind of see that the goal, again, of all the spiritual gifts is the edification of the body. And so we should practice them in that way.